Morning, Gillian. It's great to have you on the podcast today.
Morning.
So this is something that's come up a lot in my conversations recently. The cell danger response, which is something I know we'll be discussing during our conversation today. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, though, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience and how you ended up in this sort of world of functional nutrition, one might say, and naturopathy?
Mm-hmm.
I'll get that word right one of these days. But yeah, just your intro into all of this would be amazing.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, thank you for having me here today. And I'm delighted to talk about one of the topics closest to my heart. I suppose, it began with studying herbalism when I was very young, about 20, straight out of university. And then I spent a lot of my life in Germany. My husband, as a doctor, was working in a very sort of holistic field there. And so I came into contact with many, many wonderful doctors and began studying the mitochondria with a group of naturopaths and doctors there in great detail, probably about 21 years ago. And the Cell Symbiosis Academy with which I was working was very active. It's no longer really in existence, unfortunately. Some of the key doctors running it have sort of retired now. But when I came back to England, I continued my studies and certified as a nutritional therapist and naturopath, and found myself working together with the Academy of Nutritional Medicine, where I still am. About 15 years ago, I'm now the director of research, and we run a lot of fascinating niche tests that nobody else is running, really, like very specific ways to detect stealth infections and mitochondrial tests, which are really unique worldwide, actually, and tests of autoimmune encephalopathy, quite a few different kinds. I won't go through them all. We also organize events and webinars and do a lot of sort of cross-pollination. We link up a lot of different organizations as best we can and hope that they'll speak to each other and exchange information. And that's sort of our mission, really.
Yeah, that's quite the story, and I suppose having a husband who's already in the sort of the alternative world, for the want of a better word, probably opened your eyes up to a lot of maybe where conventional medicine maybe doesn't work, perhaps. You said you started off in herbalism straight out of uni, and then you went into nutrition. Were you at university initially for anything medical, or what was your story there?
No, I attended Oxford University Brasenose College and actually studied German and history. So no, it's a slightly different area, yeah. But I found I moved into sort of health-related topics quite quickly after that.
Okay, fair enough. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I hope you don't mind me asking. I'm just fascinated by people's backstories and how they sort of end up where they are.
Mm-hmm.
It's the AONM is something I've been sort of looking at on and off for a while, especially your mitochondrial tests. As you say, they are very unique and intriguing. However, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because I've sworn to myself to try and keep on today's topic of conversation, trying being the operative word. So, so the cell danger response, as I mentioned earlier, this is something I'm fascinated by because, well, for me anyway, it really arguably the lowest common denominator when it comes to talking about disease in general? Obviously, I know that's a bit of a blanket statement, and it does skew towards more diseases that have this sort of cellular metabolic dysfunction in origin. But I do think it opens a lot of doors to view disease that that have been previously shut off. The idea that we can sort of look at a disease broadly speaking through the CDR lens. Before we jump into CDR specifically, though, I'd like to backtrack just a little bit and maybe discuss mitochondria for a little while. I know most folks are likely familiar with these little organelles, these sort of cellular components, and that they really help produce energy in the form of ATP within the cell and within the body. However, they do a lot more than that. And while we won't have a whole discussion about mitochondria, I'd love to talk about maybe how they're involved in the endocrine system or later on in the conversation as well. But at a high sort of a baseline level, can you describe what mitochondria are and what they do in the body? Maybe aside from just creating cellular energy.
Yes, well, they originated from bacteria, and then there was an endosymbiosis event where these sort of cyanobacteria and archaea joined up and were able to produce a lot more energy that way. It's a bit of a complex story, but absolutely fascinating. And they're responsible for, as you say, a lot more than just our energy, though they are considered to be the sort of power plants of the cell. They're responsible for nutrient sensing and energy metabolism. That's really the sort of bioenergetics sphere, and then also for biosynthesis. They synthesize a lot of molecules. For example, heme is synthesized largely in the mitochondria. And if they're down, then you'll have a lot of issues with heme production. Cholesterol is cleaved in the inner mitochondrial membrane. And so without proper operation of the mitochondria, you'll find that you don't get the steroid hormones downstream that you need in the proper order. It's also responsible for signaling, and the ROS, the reactive oxygen species, very much have their role to play as well. Oxidative shielding is what Dr. Navio from the CDR field that we'll be talking about soon actually calls it, rather than oxidative damage, that it's shielding that these reactive oxygen species are providing, as well as signaling. A lot of cell-to-cell communication takes place via the mitochondria too. And they're also able to form chains, and it's fission as well as fusion. They're not just sausage shapes. They can actually transfer electrons from one to another, migrate to different organs, different parts of the body where more energy is needed, and multiply as required. So they're very, very intelligent little beings. I call them sort of our biochips.
Yeah, no, I mean, all sort of jokes aside, I mean, if you'd said that a couple of years ago, you probably would have got into trouble talking about chips in your cells and all of that. I think what I'd love to jump down, or the rabbit hole there that I'd maybe like to explore a bit further, is maybe the hormonal connection. So we had Dr. Eric Belkowicz from the States on a few months back to talk about thyroid. And he's very focused on treating the thyroid and the endocrine system in general, and dysfunction there from a mitochondrial standpoint. And yeah, that sort of got me down the thyroid mitochondrial rabbit hole, which maybe we can touch on later as well. But it does raise the question of what you really pointed to earlier, this idea that mitochondria take, and let me see if I got this right, they take cholesterol and then they help turn it into pregnenolone.
That's right. Yeah.
And that whole sort of steroid cascade there. Would you mind breaking this process down a little more for us? Because I do think it's quite fundamental to not only our discussion, but also to a sort of a broader discussion on why people maybe don't necessarily react as well to hormone replacement replacement therapy as they think they would if they've got sort of a mitochondrial issue.
Yes, absolutely. It's the cholesterol side cleavage enzyme called the P450cc that converts cholesterol into pregnenolone, and that takes place in the inner mitochondrial membrane. And if your mitochondria are dysfunctional, then obviously that will not be happening as well as it should. Obviously, it's not going to break down all over the body, but depending on where the dysfunction is taking place, you'll find that you don't make your steroid hormones as well as you should, and obviously that's a large number. So I totally agree with you that if you're using bioidentical or even non-bioidentical hormone therapy, that might well be a reason why it's just not getting into that cascade and simply not functioning if you've got the mitochondrial dysfunction underlying it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that I think a lot of individuals and practitioners alike miss, that that hormonal function is always sort of, at least from a mitochondrial standpoint and the way I view it, and feel free to correct me if you see fit, it's always the sort of the last piece of the puzzle to really come into sort of play. And I think lots of people will oftentimes jump into HRT and then sort of still be sort of upset, surprised, sort of unhappy by the fact that they still got a lot of the symptoms that they currently have, because they've been told that their issues are just hormonal, when in fact it's a mitochondrial issue that has manifested as a hormonal issue.
Absolutely.
And yeah, just one more question there while we're at it. What do you think about this idea of pregnenolone steal? Excuse me, I'll get that word right one of these days. I know it's often taught in sort of the functional integrative space. It's something I don't agree with, this idea that you only have a certain amount of pregnenolone, and if you take pregnenolone, it's going to be maybe buffered towards one or another type of hormone. When in reality, the way I view it is that each cell is obviously going to contain mitochondria, and that's going to be specific to each organ system or gland system. So the way I view it is that pregnenolone actually can't be stolen, because it's always been made locally within the group of tissues that it's been utilized in by those mitochondria. Would you agree with that, or do you think that this concept of pregnenolone steal is real?
No, I do completely agree with you, and it's fascinating actually to see sometimes how high cholesterol in the serum, which is the only place it's ever measured, is often actually due to the mitochondrial dysfunction that we're talking about, and the fact that the pregnenolone isn't being converted, and therefore you're getting this buildup of cholesterol outside the cells in the serum, and that's being measured, and you're getting alarm signals, and actually the ramifications go far, far deeper.
Yeah, no, it's something. It's yeah. Like I said, I think a lot of people have a lot of opinions about it, and I'm just a chemist, so it's always great to hear this from someone who's in clinical practice and who sees this in the real world, apart from me just trying to piece these parts of the puzzle together and wondering if I'm missing something or not. Okay, I'd love to sort of start to maybe steer the conversation towards CDR and where mitochondrial function, CDR, and maybe why we have dysfunctional mitochondria. But before we get into that, maybe if we could explore why mitochondria become dysfunctional to begin with. Now, I know there's a lot to unpack there again, and that mitochondria can be made dysfunctional or become dysfunctional for a number of reasons: infections, high levels of toxic exposure, etc. And with regards to the latter, if anyone really is interested in toxic exposure, I invite them to listen to the podcast, that we did with Dr. Jenny Goodman a few months back. It was a good listen. a good conversation, should I say. But from your perspective, and clinically speaking, I suppose, which is really what counts at the end of the day, what are you finding to be the biggest triggers with regards to why mitochondria are becoming dysfunctional to begin with?
Yeah, well, I mean, it falls into several categories. Biological, as you've just mentioned, the bacteria, the viruses, parasites, fungi, and then chemical, particularly electrophilic chemicals due to the energy systems in the cell, um, lindane and all the different sort of chemical additives, and metals as well, heavy metals, lead and cadmium and
Would things like
mercury and so.
glyphosates fall into that category?
Glyphosate, absolutely, as well, yes.
Okay.
And then, of course, psychological/emotional, which converts into physiological stress too. So it's stresses of all these different kinds. And then, of course, metabolic stress, if any pathways are not working properly due to lack of cofactors, then that's a very important stress too. So it's the stresses along those, I would say, 4 different pathways: biological, chemical, metabolic, and psychological/emotional.
Yeah.
And can I just add one more
Of
in,
course.
which, of course, we've suddenly encountered these last 5 years, which is SARS-CoV-2 virus, and the spike protein is able to fragment the mitochondria, and that's very, very serious. And it also prevents apoptosis in a much more intense way than other viruses that we've seen previously. And so
apoptosis being pre-programmed cell death, is that correct?
exactly. And
Okay.
so the lysosome and the phagosome are unable to link up as they should and sort of get rid of the dysfunctional cells and mitochondria, and that's really very, very serious indeed, making it very difficult for people to recover. It's being called long COVID, whatever the condition actually is.
Yeah, no, we interviewed Dr. Tina Pierce, and she's got she definitely looks at the whole long COVID thing from a mast cell standpoint specifically, which I do think is interesting. I'm not sure it's the entire picture, but for a lot of people, I think, yeah, long COVID definitely seems to drive sort of an exacerbated histamine response. And I've actually got a question on that later. But I do find it interesting that you raised the whole psychological side of things. Well, I think what, again, most people miss is that stress is stress, and everybody's always looking for some sort of, broadly speaking, external trigger, I think. Somebody's looking for an infection as to why they have the ailments they have, or they are looking at some sort of underlying toxic exposure. And I think what most people miss, unfortunately, is that ultimately the body is going to take all that stress at some level, and it is going to be that sympathetic or that fight or flight response in the body, which is then going to drive all those transcription factors and pro-inflammatory pathways, which then is going to drive that mitochondrial dysfunction at the level of CDI, as we'll discuss shortly.
Absolutely. I work quite closely with Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt,
Yeah.
who works on sort of 5 levels of healing.
Yeah.
And we've seen incredible change in patients as a result of even looking at sort of ancestral trauma that they may be carrying down with them. This is something that he learned through working with someone called Bernd Hellinger, who lived with the Zulus for many, many years, working as their priest, and found how very, very important the extended family is, and how that sort of morphogenetic approach, if you begin to sort of look into that, can also be a missing piece of the puzzle.
Sorry, did you say the Zulus as in the isiZulus?
Yes, they
Yeah.
sort of have incredible practices that do take into account missing members of the family, whether it's because it was a miscarriage or an early death or a murder or whatever, but all of that has an impact on the larger family too.
Yeah, no, I just mentioned it because I grew up in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa.
Did you?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
So, sort of originally from the UK, then but spent my entire sort of, well, most of my life in South Africa.
Oh,
So,
how fascinating.
yeah. So, it's a lovely country. It really is. It's going through a sort of a, should we say, a bit of a struggle at the moment. And if you like electricity, and I suggest you don't live there. But beyond that, it really is a beautiful country.
I'm sure I'd love to go there.
And
Mhm.
yeah, no, it's maybe not somewhere to live at the moment, but from a cultural standpoint, from a geographic sort of standpoint, it really is an amazing country.
Mm.
Anyway, so like to get back on track, as I was saying earlier, Dr. Dr. Balkovich, who I interviewed at the beginning of the year, looks at this through the lens of it being adaptive physiology, and in his from his vantage point, from his viewpoint, he sees all of this dysfunction as the body not necessarily entering into a state of dysfunction, but rather down regulating its physiology, sort of based on the fact that it's under this sort of high allostatic high allostatic load, and that we shouldn't view this physiology as broken per se, but as the result of being in this state where it's sort of it's down regulating these vital bodily processes.
Well, that does sound a little bit similar to the CDR in that that's the mitochondria's sort of ability to detect potential harm and damage to the cells, organs, body, and therefore they downregulate and change a lot of their functions to, it's an evolutionary sort of conserved protective mechanism. Absolutely, yeah. And the different steps of it are obviously quite complex, but have been very, very well mapped out by Dr. Navio and his teams.
Yes, one day I'll get him onto a call. I think I sent him an
Oh,
email.
that would be fantastic.
I sent him an email at least once a month. I've yet to have a reply, but I don't know. I'll keep on
Let's
pushing.
keep trying. Yeah.
Keep on pushing my luck. I'm a bit like a dog with a bone when it comes to it. Honestly, I think that's a perfect time to sort of segue into CDR, and maybe we can discuss that in a fair amount of detail. I think the way I see it, there's these three sort of stages of the cell danger response, and we get stuck in there. However, this is definitely your realm of expertise and something I just look at with a sort of from a passionate hobbyist sort of viewpoint. So, yeah, I'd love it if you could start to break down CDR and help us to understand what exactly is going on there.
Yes, well, according to Dr. Navio and his teams, as I say, they've even done very large studies using NIH grants of millions on this. So it's not just sort of a couple of articles that he wrote back in 2014. It's really been, taken up really worldwide, though it's not fully integrated into, obviously, conventional medicine thinking yet. It's sort of not reached the medical textbooks, I don't think. But there's CDR1, which is the sort of innate immune response to these various different factors that I mentioned earlier. And if the mitochondria detect a threat along any of those lines that I mentioned, and I think I forgot to emphasize physical as well. I mean, obviously a major car accident or even breaking your arm or whatever, that's all included, then they will decrease their oxygen consumption initially in order to allow the oxygen to instead suffuse the cytosol, and that changes the pH, it changes the way that enzymes act, and it also it's both oxidant and increases the oxygen for antioxidants. So, having more oxygen in the cytosol has a dual function. It's both able to, for example, kill or attempt to kill the pathogens that have, for example, been found there, but it can also power the superoxide dismutase, glutathione peroxidase, catalase, thioreductase. All these antioxidants need a little oxygen to actually power them. And if you see higher levels of oxygen being used outside the mitochondria in the cell, then that's a very good sign for this kind of battle that's going on. It's often called the power plants turning into the battleships, as it were. So they're downregulating in order to allow this sort of battle to take place in the cytosol. And another thing that happens is that the cell membranes are stiffened in order to prevent egress of, again, any pathogens that may be detected. For example, the spike protein to prevent in and out, so that the composition of the cell membranes changes. And they also release antimicrobial and antibacterial, antiviral chemicals. Interestingly, they're able to do that. Yeah, and they increase autophagy to the extent they can. Obviously, if you've had a major blow like the spike protein, as I mentioned, preventing that, then they'll do their very best to, via mitochondrial fission and mitophagy, which is the breakdown and recycling of the mitochondria themselves, and they'll attempt to sort of operationalize that. And
at this point, would cardiolipin be damaged within the mitochondria, within the cell?
I don't think it would be damaged as such. It would just be not allowing fats into the mitochondria to the extent that it normally does. That's its key role. But I mean, if you're not going to fire up the mitochondria like you would normally, then you're neither going to take in the fats to the extent that you would normally, nor the carbohydrates. And it also releases ATP as a sort of, it's called eATP, extracellular ATP, that acts as a warning signal and actually communicates to other cells, a bit like the pheromones of sort of trees that one hears about in plants, sending out warning signals to each other. And it also alters host behavior in that the person themselves loses energy, becomes a lot less active, may just feel they have to spend some time in bed. But that's all part of this healing response. The energy simply isn't there any longer for those kinds of activities. So that would be CDR1. And hopefully, if that resolves the individual's issue, then soon enough, the mitochondria will take up their normal activities again, and the cell danger response will discontinue. But it is possible for it to get what's called stuck, and or maybe there's a need for it. If it's been very, very major inflammation that's taken place, then the cell does need to spend a lot of time building the new macromolecules that you need for new cells to replace those that have gone under through inflammation. So it's building new lipids and new carbohydrates and new proteins. And so all of that will require the glycolysis. And increasingly, if you move to aerobic glycolysis of CDR2, which is where there is oxygen present, but it's being again used for this sort of rebuilding of cells outside the cell, this is called a sort of proliferative phase. And obviously you don't want this to go on for too long, because proliferation obviously signals at the end of the chain cancer, which is just, one stage along a particular trajectory. We shouldn't be sort of frightened of that word like we are, but nevertheless, this proliferative stage, CDR2, of aerobic glycolysis, will hopefully not continue indefinitely, but move on to what's called CDR3, which is the third stage that Dr. Navio and his teams have identified, which is where the oxidative phosphorylation is beginning to start up again, but you've still got the cells in many parts of the body working, and the mitochondria as well, working independently rather than in a sort of very coordinated way. I have a slide here that includes all the different conditions under CDR1, 2, and 3 disorders, and it's absolutely incredible the number of disorders that are even listed under CDR3, like autism and chronic fatigue, of course, which can, persist for years and even decades. And it's a kind of, hibernation of the mitochondria that has really, to a certain extent, got stuck. What we have is the vagus nerve, which is, of course, extremely extensive, and that has both a ventral and a dorsal kind of chain to it, component exactly, and Porges and others have written, really comprehensive literature on this. It would appear that the ventral stage, which is the sort of healing component of the vagus nerve, is in these cases downregulated, and instead you have an upregulation of the dorsal, which corresponds to the CDR, and that can, in some cases, simply become, it's a bit like cellular memory. It can become the sort of new normal for the patient. It's like a set point that has been changed. And so a lot of work is being done by Porges and others, including, interestingly, even Professor Gerald Pollack. His work feeds into this massively as well, to kind of try and regain the normal cell functions, including the dorsal signaling of the I'm sorry, not the dorsal, the ventral signaling of the vagus nerve.
That's fascinating. I wasn't aware Dr. Pollack was doing any specific research into...
Well, not directly, but it all links up, because the EZ water, the exclusion zone water, which you'll know about and have probably done other sort of podcasts on, is so central to getting that signaling back again. And in fact, the electrons, the neutral charge, it's a bit like a battery functioning in the cell, and getting that battery sort of conduction, the electrical conduction working again properly, does appear to a lot be connected to this fourth phase of water that Professor Pollack talks about. So he doesn't directly mention the CDR, but it is clearly part of it, as is even deuterium depletion. We're beginning to see very, very big pictures now, I think, coming together. The dots are sort of being joined very quickly now.
Yeah, no, deuterium depletion is something it's on my list of things to sort of dive into, but I think that's fascinating, especially from a sort of an oncological standpoint, and the research that's been done into reversing various metabolic diseases by from a deuterium depletion standpoint.
Let me just mention, sorry, to make that connection so that it's a bit easier to understand. It's because the mitochondria are continually producing metabolic water. This is the extraordinary thing. It's actually water that's being produced at cytochrome C oxidase as part of the part of the oxidative phosphorylation. And this metabolic water, it can be a huge amount. It's like sort of, I think, 17, we'd have to talk to Professor Borish about that, but certainly thousands of litres a day if it's being produced and recycled properly. And
maybe that's how camels work.
Exactly. Absolutely correct. Yes. And it's their fat, and it's the fats that we're eating, actually, that are making it possible for us to produce that a lot more efficiently than, again, if the mitochondria are working. So it's gradually encouraging that metabolic water in our system to begin working again, because without it, the mitochondria can't work either. And it would appear to be low deuterium or deuterium depletion that both the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain are creating in our mitochondria. And so I'm quite sure that Dr. Navio, when you speak to him, will agree that part of the recovery process will be encouraging this metabolic water to be created in a much more efficient way.
That's fascinating. I mean, what I've taken from that more so than anything is if camels get a fright, they're probably stuffed.
Yeah.
Sorry. Maybe just a bit more of a technical question, if you don't mind. Do you think that EATP that you mentioned earlier, and then other metabolites there are, so things like succinate, adenosine, etc. Do you think that they could play a role in amplifying or sort of sustaining that CDR response across tissues and cells, if they're elevated?
Oh, absolutely, yes. But I mean, hopefully they're working in an intelligent manner in order to simply, get the message across. Look, there's danger, ahoy. We've got to, alter pathways in these different manners, but not in a completely dysfunctional way. But I suppose eventually, I mean, I know that it's possible to measure DNA that's sort of floating around in the bloodstream that shouldn't be there as well.
mtDNA.
Exactly, mitochondrial DNA, and that's a bad sign if you see it. But again, I very much go with Dr. Navio's thinking, which is that we shouldn't be considering these things as from a negative standpoint, but just trying to understand what the signal is that they're trying to give us. And I find,
again, just that sort of viewpoint of the physiology being adapted, not necessarily
exactly.
broken.
Yeah.
What about the epigenetic changes? And I think maybe the best example is, and hypothetically speaking, of course, say we were exposed to a sort of a massive viral pandemic. I mean, imagine that. And then we were then treated with a quickly developed vaccine that may or may not have undergone any sufficient testing. Would it be sort of plausible in your view that maybe a vaccine like this could sort of create epigenetic changes by sort of altering histones and other DNA and RNA components that could then drive up immune system activation and that purogenic signaling, and then to the extent that the body might end up stuck in CDR1, obviously through that epigenetic lens. Do you think that's at all feasible?
Most definitely. I'm very, very unhappy about what we've seen over the last 4 years or so. I know it's not a good idea to talk about this too much on podcasts that are going to go out on YouTube and so on, but yes, I mean, the body has such incredible intelligence, and these tiniest little pathways and organelles and so on are all working at a rate of knots in such a sophisticated way that introducing something of the kind that you've just mentioned that could potentially disrupt that processing is I think misplaced on many different levels. Yeah, and it's not for me, obviously, really to decide, but I think that some of the difficulties that therapists and doctors are finding worldwide in assisting patients to recover finding it much harder than they used to at the moment could partly be linked to the whole pandemic and set of issues related to that we've experienced. Yeah.
I think for me, and this is a very slight tangent, is that maybe the silver lining of the pandemic and long COVID is that it's brought to light this idea of these chronic fatigue-like syndromes, this myalgic encephalomyelitis, these, broadly speaking, these issues, which I suppose originally sort of started off as Gulf War syndrome, as PTSD, and these other issues. And for me, anyway, having struggling with it myself to an extent, I think it definitely has, it's brought an awareness to the issue at large, which obviously, as you know, dealing with people on a regular basis, I'm sure, is a very sort of proliferative issue in society. So yeah, I mean, obviously we never would have wanted it to occur, but silver lining and all of that, I think it's just brought a greater awareness to these mitochondrial disorders. If you view long COVID essentially as a mitochondrial disorder, which I think we'd probably agree that it fundamentally is when you sort of remove all the triggers. Gillian, I think this would be a great time to sort of maybe segue into how you start to deal with, how you start to work with clients when helping them to overcome these issues. Actually, no, first maybe we could discuss mitochondrial tests. Sorry, I'm a bit all over the place. I know through the AONM, I'll probably get that right at one point, you have several options with regards to mitochondrial testing, and they're all amazing, and I'm definitely going to have to somehow convince you to send me some sample reports.
Delighted to. Yes, we do. We do an ATP profile, which shows the total ATP, which is of course composed of the site of the ATP being produced along glycolysis as well as within the mitochondria. So one must never forget, some ATP is obviously being produced outside the mitochondria too. And then the capacity of the mitochondria to produce ATP and of the glycolytic pathway, and then the alternative sort of reserve, as it's called, ATP production as well. So that's the mitochondria at rest. And then there's a second one, which is called the Mitochondrial Health Index, that shows the mitochondria under pressure too. And that would indicate first of all, the degree to which oxygen is not being used in the mitochondria as it should. A maximum of 10% should be used outside for the processes that we've just talked about, but not more than that. And if there is more than that, then you can usually, what would determine exactly what processes might be causing that issue. It is a sign of a cell danger response. And there are markers. It's an 11-page report, so it contains a lot of markers like the proton leak, exactly whether the mitochondrial membrane is not quite as sort of patent as integral as it should be. The coupling efficiency, in other words, how well the electrons are sort of hopping from one complex to another, and the degree of post-exertional fatigue. You can also work out from what's called the reserve. When the mitochondria are put under pressure, they should be able to expand by about 400% in terms of the energy that they produce, and often it's a lot less than that. So there's a number of different markers that you can sort of put together, and there's an algorithm that calculates the what's called Mitochondrial Health Index, which is useful to compare if you want to sort of repeat it after 6 months or whatever. And then there are tests to calculate the mitochondrial DNA compared to the nuclear DNA. Obviously, you have one nucleus, but many mitochondria, so you can work out from that how many mitochondria there are in the cell. And if you have too few, mitobiogenesis, which is the generation of new mitochondria, would be useful, whereas if you have too many, then that's a sign of the cell having detected a lack of energy and attempting to compensate for it by producing more mitochondria. But there is also a marker for how functional they are. And if a lot of them are dysfunctional, even if you have many, what's called mitophagy, which we discussed earlier, would be the approach rather than generating lots of new ones. And you can work out the degree to which the mitochondria are suffering from reactive oxygen species actually beginning to impact the DNA of the mitochondria, which is serious. So it's good to pick that up early. And the lactate pyruvate index actually shows you the fuels that are getting into the mitochondria, which is very useful too.
That's incredible.
Very, very useful. Yes, you can work out whether the mitochondria are able to process fats or whether they're at a stage where they're more readily able to process carbohydrates or perhaps that the carbohydrates aren't even getting in,
Wow.
and they're being backpedaled into lactate, which the body can use, but it's a messier process. And so if you've got a high lactate level, then that's a sign that the mitochondria really have shut down to a large extent, and they're not even allowing the carbohydrates in. So you can tell quite a lot about the mitochondrial fuels from that. And there are various others as well. Yeah.
I'm either going to rob someone, break the piggy bank, or put in for a job, because those all sound absolutely amazing. I love the fact that you brought up those various metabolic shuttles, and I think a sort of a poor man's version of that would be to sort of measure glucose, ketones, and then lactate, which obviously you can do independently, and you use those as proxies as well, which I think would, wow, that would be interesting to cross-reference those values directly with some of those tests to identify whether or how you are, how effectively you're utilizing fatty acids for fuel sources. I was actually going to ask this later, and actually I will. I was going to ask a question about ketogenic diets later, but yeah, we'll get there.
Well, I mean, we could just throw in now that that does show quite effectively that in some cases, attempting to utilize a high-fat diet for a patient is simply not going to be the right thing for them at that particular time. You can, of course, attempt to kind of encourage ketones by giving beta hydroxybutyrate precursors and so on. That's a kind of way of leaping over the normal pathways into the mitochondria. And hopefully, as in the books about how useful ketones can be for Alzheimer's and so on, the Newton book and so on, there's good evidence that you can encourage that pathway, but actually utilizing a high fat diet, which is obviously often part of a ketogenic diet, is not always the right thing for the patient. And they'll probably be able to give you that feedback as well.
Yes, I'm sure they will very quickly. Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. And again, I know people like Dr. Myhill are great proponents of the ketogenic diet, but as you've just alluded to now, I do think that they can be problematic, which can be problematic in my view when you start dealing with people with these sort of upper fermenting gut tissues as well, when they are so reactive to carbohydrates. And I think that starts to provide a challenge. But I suppose that's where you start to look at things like maybe a low FODMAP diet to remove potentially those triggering FODMAPs to help maybe allow a certain amount of carbohydrate ingestion while still not creating that fermentation that drives those dysbiotic conditions. Yeah, no, it's definitely a rabbit hole. Just maybe one more question, if you don't mind, just regarding the ketones. Clinically, do you find there's any difference between the salts and the esters when providing somebody with a ketone supplement, or do you not find it makes
well, the
that much
esters
difference?
are very much more expensive.
Yeah.
And so there's often a bit of a reluctance among patients to use those. But salts have been very effective as well. I've had very good reports from patients and from doctors who are working with them as well. One doctor I know who managed to, or at least his patient managed to overcome his diabetes type 2 by using ketone salts, along with, obviously, there's so many other things that a patient is using that you can't always, identify that it's the one thing. But I do need to mention that I am, and I'd love you to interview Morley Robbins at some point as well. He is actually coming over to England on the 21st and 22nd of May. He'll be holding 2 events here. I've sort of helped to liaise that, and I have been following his approach with the root cause protocol for about 3 years now, quite intensively. And I must say that despite all my, couple of decades really, a couple of decades of studying the mitochondria, I had not realized how very, very important bioavailable copper is for not just complex for, the cytochrome C oxidase, but also complex 5 and the Krebs cycle and the production of heme and so on. It's absolutely central, and also retinol. And so the pathway that's been worked out over many, many years by the root cause protocol group. I first heard him in Seattle when I was over there, actually, with Dr. Klinghardt, who was speaking sort of from the same platform. And I kind of made a mental note for myself, gosh, this is somebody who I've got to follow as well, and finally got round to it. And I must say there's extraordinary knowledge there. He's just done a very brilliant podcast with Dr. Malik that would be worth listening to for anybody who wants to sort of, understand where he's coming from. But it's centrally involved in the mitochondria, and that's because you were asking me what I suggest to patients. Very, very, very often I find that sort of sorting that mineral pathway, the electrolytes, making sure that they're getting sufficient retinol, which is problematic if it's a vegetarian or vegan patient, because you can't really obtain retinol from non-meat sources or dairy. And then introducing the bioavailable copper, that can really be miraculous and really, really help the mitochondria to get sort of back into action again. So that is one of the very first pathways that I think about. And I sort of think back to cases I've had in the past, like fatty liver, where I now understand the vital importance of those pathways in that as well, and sort of think, gosh, I probably would have gone to that immediately in the past too if I'd known of it. So I think that's extremely useful. I'll if you can't make it down to London in May, well, we're already in May, aren't we, for the events, then I'll send you the recording if we manage to make one.
Oh, that'd be lovely. And if you could ask Morley to answer my emails, that'd be better.
Oh, I will do. Absolutely.
I'm sure he gets thousands, so I'm not too. I have. He publicly displays his email address everywhere. MorleyRobbins@gmail.com. So I'm sure he gets 5.5 million emails on daily. But yeah, I've been trying to
as soon as he's over here, I'll mention that. Maybe he can even find time while he's over here, which is about 7 days, to have an interview with you. That would be superb.
I'd love
to.
It? Yeah, no, if we can make something happen, that would be amazing. Yeah, no, I've not dived that deeply into the root cause protocol. I think as you know, you have your list of things to get through, and then inevitably something falls by the wayside.
I know it took me a long time to get to it, but I'm so glad that I did. And I did want to mention that because you asked me what the different initiatives are. Another great inspiration I find is actually Dr. Jack Kruse. I don't know if you know of him, the neurosurgeon, but he emphasizes the importance of light for the mitochondria. And yes, but I mean, if
he's definitely you were to ask character.
Yes, if you were to ask me what sort of the key influence for the mitochondria is, I mean, something that we all find so difficult these days because of the kinds of jobs and, residences and where we live, it's so hard, but actually getting out into the sun and into nature and grounding more and so on. It all sounds so simple, but it's very, very hard to do. How much of our day do we spend doing that? And that's what our mitochondria are craving, actually, a lot of the time.
Yeah, definitely. They're photoelectric, photodynamic
Absolutely.
organelles, and they require this input. We're I mean, I don't mean this sort of with any disrespect, but I think people sort of, they don't realize that we're sun beings, and that it's become culturally appropriate to now just sit in a dark room all day, whereas technically we photosynthesize to a large extent. So by removing that aspect of our biology, we are essentially, becoming completely dysfunctional. Dr. Kruse is someone I would also like to talk to, although I'll be honest, he scares the living daylights out of me. And when he goes down the physics rabbit hole, I get a bit bamboozled, I must admit. I think the last time I did physics was maybe second year uni, and then that was it.
It's always a long listen, but there's brilliance in there as well.
No, definitely. He is a wealth of knowledge, that is for sure. So I suppose ultimately dealing with these chronic diseases and comes down to sort of ultimately identifying what causes the trigger. And what I'm trying to do is maybe create a framework for people who aren't physicians or practitioners to sort of follow. And it fundamentally, and feel free to interject wherever you see fit. But the way I see it is, you first got to find the root cause, your trigger, which is driving this dysfunction to begin with, whether it be mold and infection like Lyme or what have you. And then to concurrently lower the toxic load on your body as much as possible. Then again, and that I think is where most people are going to struggle the most, and where it is behoove the correct word, then to work with a practitioner such as yourself, and then to start working through the other components of this dysfunction, such as dealing with emotional issues, dealing with adverse childhood events, etc., and then to slowly reintroduce the nutrients that support mitochondrial function, and to then hopefully get to the point where they have proper hormonal signaling and blessed dysbiotic guts, etc. Would that,
Absolutely.
sort of as a
Yes.
hierarchy, sort of be a functional way to sort of approach it, do you
Yes.
think?
And what's very interesting is there that you mentioned supporting the mitochondria a little bit later in that process. And often one's sort of gut reaction, one's knee-jerk reaction is to start giving large numbers of mitochondrial nutrients very quickly, like CoQ10, 300 milligrams or whatever. And actually, if the mitochondria have downregulated intelligently and intentionally and are unable to process those kinds of nutrients at the present time, it's just an inappropriate thing to do. I mean, you've always got to be supporting the mitochondria in a basic way, of course, but giving lots and lots of very specific nutrients at the beginning of that process, when you're still in CDR1 or 2, is probably less efficient.
Yeah, with the exception of something like methylene blue, which I'll ask you about in a bit. But the way I see it, if you're bombarding a system that is electrical with too many electron donors, you're potentially just going to create a high reactive oxygen, just a high level of ROS, is it between complex
Absolutely.
4 and
Yeah.
5.
Yeah.
So ultimately, you're going to end up doing more harm potentially than good.
Yes, and a lot of it will be escaping through the UCPs, the uncoupling proteins, and just creating heat rather than creating energy.
Yeah, and then
if it's getting into the mitochondria at all.
Yeah, there are. So I work not directly, but I have a lot to do with a lot of bodybuilders, and a lot of them use these various uncoupling agents to utilize it from a fat loss perspective. And interestingly enough, there have been a few who have sort of shown some sort of signs of clinical remission by utilizing these compounds. Not that I would suggest, or I'm sure you would, that using something like DMT is in any way safe. These thermogenic compounds, if you overdo them even slightly, they can actually kill you. So, but yeah, it is interesting that by sort of uncoupling mitochondria deliberately, you can actually see an improvement in energy, which I suppose makes sense. But yeah, it comes with a lot of potential drawbacks. Anyway, that is a rabbit hole and a tangent. Gillian, you've been a star. I think I'd like to close off with a few rapid fire questions, if that's okay. We can answer them. They're never rapid fire, but we can, just a few sort of off the cuff questions. Okay, so starting off, if you could fast forward mitochondrial medicine, say 10 years, what breakthrough would you hope to see, or would you like to see?
Oh goodness, I'd like to see a lot more simplicity. It's the simplicity beyond the complexity, and so I do hope that together with others we can work towards that, to make it a lot easier to overcome the cell danger response and restore patients' health, not have people stuck in ME for 20 and 30 years. I'd love that. I mean, someone like Ron Davis, Professor Davis in the States, the Open Medicine Foundation, his son is that's what gives him his motivation, unable to even take in sensations from around him. We sometimes can't even speak to him. this is so clearly a mitochondrial issue, and to be able to find simpler solutions would be absolutely tremendous. And affordable solutions as well.
Yes, there we go. That's unfortunately, medicine, I think, is still in that that place where health is bought, and these problems aren't complex. I mean, they are complex to solve, but I feel there are so many solutions that are readily available. They just aren't accessible to 99.9% of the population at the moment. And that's a bit of a tragedy, and it's definitely it is a stumbling block for most, because it really, when you sort of understand the basics of it, like I do, and I'm nothing special, you do realize how simple these issues, broadly speaking, are to solve. At least initially. Obviously, if you're dealing with something more complicated, like a long COVID, where there's potentially a spike protein involvement, then it gets more complicated. But there are definitely solutions. They've just got to be accessible. Your answer is definitely, it's great. I was going to be obnoxious and say something like mitochondrial transplants, which I think
no.
Which
The
are exciting.
The body is too intelligent to need that kind of intervention from us.
I'm just excited.
Aubrey de Grey and his attempts over the years. Thank you. Thanks very much. But
what can I say? It's a biochemist in me. I just want to see what happens when someone prods something with something else. Okay, next one. Red light therapy is thought to improve mitochondrial function, and I suppose it does, at least peripherally. Do you think it's effective at helping to improve CDR, or is it not that much?
Yes, absolutely. I think that photobiomodulation is massively important, and that, along with the light that I mentioned earlier, is sometimes patients can't take a lot of supplements, and they can't even take a lot of obviously trying transdermal nutrients, electrolytes, and so on can help, but sometimes you really do have to start with these more sort of extracorporeal types of therapy. And I think that red light, perhaps just an umbrella, above the person's head, perhaps just for 3 minutes, once every couple of days, I've seen that make a huge difference as well. It's got to be the right frequency. And there are specialists like Dr. Damien Downing, who I know you're interviewing very soon, who have spent many, many years looking into that and have a whole range of products related to that. It would be very, very important, really, not to waste your money on the wrong frequency. But, there are specialists available who can give one that kind of information.
Yeah, there definitely are. Vagus nerve stimulators. There are a few out there. Are you a fan of these? Do you think they're effective?
I haven't used them myself. Items like the Sensate, again, through working closely with Dr. Damien, because I am a member of the BSEM as well on the committee. So I attend every event of theirs, and he's seen benefits from that. And I do have colleagues who also have done, but I haven't recommended them myself. Not yet. No.
Fair enough. And the last one, and maybe this one is a bit obscure, so if needs be, we can cut it down to stories. But what do you think about mitochondrial support peptides, things like MOTC or SS31? I don't know if you've come across these, or if you've got any sort of thoughts on them. Do you think they're effective? Have you utilized them in practice?
Dr. Holzdorf in the States, for example, is a great specialist in those. I haven't used them, and they're difficult to access here. And I think you would really need to be an MD, I would say, really, to use them. I think even in the States, the FDA has removed a lot of them from the market now, perhaps without any justification, but it's a bit of a hot potato. I would much prefer to start with something simpler, like I was just explaining previously, the right balance of minerals, checking, the patient's sodium status. POTS is so often just a matter of getting the potassium and the sodium ratios right. And starting with the basics. And often I do find people have been through the most incredible odysseys, perhaps even using apheresis, which is filtering of the blood, the entire blood, attempting to remove the antibodies. And aspects such as I've just mentioned have not been touched on at all. So diet, of course, is so important as well. So, using the, as I say, simpler sort of more accessible techniques would be my preference. But I'd be very prepared to sort of take part in seminars and learn more about the peptides. I just haven't done that yet.
Yeah, no, they're definitely interesting, and things like MOTS-C, which sort of enhance insulin sensitivity and promote this sort of mitochondrial biogenesis. It acts on the folate AMPK pathway and is also thought to be an exercise mimetic, and I think downstream of that promotes some PGC1 alpha activation. And then you have things like SS31, which more, instead of that sort of the biogenesis aspect, let's see if I can get this right, it binds to cardiolipin and improves, I think it improves membrane health and the structure thereof, thereby sort of reducing ROS and improving ATP output. So they definitely are interesting, and there is definitely some therapeutic potential there. But I think, as you alluded to, it's I think the FDA has, I hate this term, clamped down on a lot of them because of the gray market aspect, and I think people have just had too much access to them. And yeah, I don't think they're inherently a problem, but I think when you start looking at things like where they're sourced, they can become an issue. A lot of them come from they're not even compounded. They just come from the Far East or whatever, where they're just manufactured, and you don't know what you get alongside them. The endotoxin load. They're obviously, the endotoxin load, the lipopolysaccharide load, heavy metals, etc. But they are, when they're used correctly, they definitely are incredible. Okay, last one. What are your thoughts on methylene blue?
I don't use it myself. I do have some concerns when I listen to what it does to the MAO pathway and or enzyme MAO, I think, and
B, yeah.
Is it B? Yes,
at a high enough dosage.
Yes. I sort of, again, I'm a little bit perhaps cautious that way, and I would prefer to see it used by doctors and not too widely accessible, just because of the risks that appear to be, in the dosage and so on. But I'm very happy to work in teams where people, which I do prefer to do, actually. I always prefer to work in multidisciplinary teams, and there might be a doctor included. I know that Dr. Klinghardt, for example, does use it, and other doctors who I know as well. So they're willing to be guided by them, but I don't recommend it myself.
Yeah, no. It's a very interesting molecule, but and obviously being an electron donor and being able to bypass some of those block complexes, I think for the right person, it's definitely a good option. In somebody who's already got healthy level mitochondrial function, it's definitely not warranted, and it can actually again cause electron leakage and with excessive use.
I think one of the things it's able to do is to switch you from ferrous ion to the ferric ion, i.e. from the 3+ to the 2+ stage, and the methanoglobemia, which is a problem as well, and for which it was originally used and still is. Yes, just makes me wonder whether there are other ways of encouraging better ion transport and releasing the trapped ion and creating the right form of ion for the body to utilize, rather than necessarily using that. But I'm open to learning more about it.
Yeah, no, it is an interesting molecule, and there's a large amount of data there around its use and sort of regulating things like ferroptosis, which is another rabbit hole for another day. But yeah, I think for a lot of people in this who are struggling with CDR, the point you touched on with regards to it being an MAOI, yeah, an monoamine oxidase inhibitor is very on point, because yeah, I mean, if you're going to inhibit MAO, you're going to sort of increase histamine levels potentially, which is going to cause all sorts of people all sorts of issues. So I think a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing, and it's ultimately up to the individual to educate themselves thoroughly if they do choose to use these sorts of compounds. But
causing the serotonin syndrome as well, which
yeah,
it can
definitely.
do. Patients, generally do disclose everything to one, but not always absolutely every last thing. Sometimes they forget, and if they are on an SSRI, it can potentially be fatal. So
Yeah, well, I think it's ultimately a bit of a Dunning-Kruger at the end of the day, isn't it? You sort of, a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. Gillian, you've been a star, and this conversation has been delightful and informative. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I've been delighted to be here. Very,
Thank
very
you.
honoured. Yeah.
If people want to work with you, if they want to find out more about the AONM, I think I got there. Where would you like to point them? Where can they find you?
Well, the Academy of Nutritional Medicine, AONM, is readily accessible at the URL aonm.org, and all our tests and our events are there. I hold, a bit like you, a podcast about, or webinar about once a week, and I'm always there, and have an email, Gillian, with one L, interestingly, at aonm.org, where I can always be reached as well. So thank you so much. It's absolutely stunning, the different speakers you have available, and I'm going to go back now over all of your recordings and listen to them, because it sounds as though you have amazing topics that you've covered and now planning to cover. Thank you.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. We'll chat soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.